Hey, everybody. It's not Monday and it's not noon Pacific, but it's still content chat. We have a bonus content chat for you this week with my guest, Kate DiLeo, because I had to reschedule our conversation. And rather than having Kate wait until the next Monday in the schedule that was open, I'm like, let's just sneak an extra one in because we deserve it, right? I think we deserve it. So, Kate,
Absolutely.
welcome to Content Chat.
Erika, thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, you and I have had a number of fantastic conversations, and I'm just really psyched that you're going to
Yeah.
be sharing some really good branding tactics, strategy, and tips with folks because I think branding is something that a lot of content marketers kind of struggle with because
Mhm.
the way that you brand your content is not or shouldn't be the same way that you're branding all of those big brand assets and
Mhm.
having, I think people can really struggle with how do you bring a brand alive in the content that you create. So I think this is going to be a fantastic conversation. But before we dive into my questions, how about you just take a minute to tell folks a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. So I am a brand architect. I have been a brand person and content person and marketer for more than 10 years now, actually. I really fell into branding, by the way, Erika, as a byproduct of my early career in sales. And it was actually in my career in sales that I recognized the power of having a simple yet provocative pitch, aka a brand pitch, that was going to compel my prospects to really want to stay on the phone and have a conversation with me or reply to that email or engage with me on social. And so, fast forward, I spent the last decade of my career helping organizations create brand messaging that really drives revenue. In other words, the messaging at its core for an organization that's telling people what they need to understand to opt in, take that next step, and buy.
I love that. That's such a good perspective. And I think it's pretty unusual. Usually we hear about, folks going into sales from marketing. I
Mhm.
don't know that we have as many folks kind of seg into marketing from sales. So that's, I think, a nice a difference between a
Yeah.
lot of the branding folks who are really art school or graphic
Yes.
design backgrounds. So I think that is definitely partially why you have such a different approach. So let's just start with the basics.
Mhm.
Why is it that we need to spend the time to develop a strong business brand and when is the right time to get started? Because I feel like a
Mhm.
lot of times, especially if you're talking about small businesses, but even startups for that matter, things will be going in stealth mode or with, an LLC name that nobody put a lot of thought into with the idea of, oh, hey, we'll get around to the branding. So, is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? I want to hear what you think.
Well, first of all, I've been there, done that, right? So I think that, if you're listening to this and you're also a fellow entrepreneur, I think a lot of us have had stealth mode at one point or another with our business, okay? So let's unpack that. So I think at the end of the day, there's never a perfect time to build a brand, but brand is always right for an organization, meaning it's always really important to think about brand as this is the promise of what we say that we deliver for the world. It's a promise of who we are and the value we bring. And by the way, when we're talking about this word branding, I think you kind of alluded to this before. A lot of times people think of brand as the visual side of it. So, the logo, the colors, the fonts. Believe it or not, I'm not a graphic designer. I am not an artist. I mean, if you ask me for a logo, I'd give you a stick figure. So I stay in my lane of the messaging side of brand. And I think for today's conversation, let's think about that, right? In other words, brand really being the promise of what you're articulating to your customers to say, this is what we do for you, this is how we solve your problem, and this is how we're different and better than the competition. That's brand at its core. So when we think about a right time, there's always a right time to do it. In other words, if you want to sell, if you want to drive revenue, you need a brand.
I love that. And I'm pretty biased because I think one of the really key things that folks need to do early on, if they're planning on using content marketing as a
Mhm.
primary way that they're approaching marketing. I think it's so important to have that defined brand voice, because as a
Yes.
content creator, if I don't have that definition in hand and I don't know how the brand shows up in the content we're creating, it's really hard and really time consuming, because then you have to go and ask for reviews and feedback and input from a bunch of people and drive consensus that, it's, you put all this extra time
Yeah.
that can actually really be saved. So I'd love to hear from your perspective, how brands can approach creating a differentiated brand voice that then is able to be activated with their content marketing.
Yeah, this is such an important topic, by the way, because, and by the way, I'll segue into this in just a second, because when we think about brand, or building a brand, you come to the room and you say, I need to build my brand. What does that even entail? Because I think that's a big question too, is what does that even mean? Well, if I were to think about the tranches or the buckets of work that I do with clients, right? If somebody comes to me from scratch, or they're saying, we need to rebrand, what does that even mean? Okay. Typically, the first bucket of work is actually looking at your brand's personality and tone of voice. In other words, how do we authentically show up in the world as an organization? Or if you're a personal brand, as an individual. The second bucket of work then, though, is who are we going after and why, which is basically target audience analysis, understanding your ideal, customers and personas that you're really trying to speak to with your organization, who you want to have purchase from you. And then you get into actually building what we call brand statements that resonate with those individuals that you've identified and, oh, by the way, sound like you. And those include two types: internal and external focused brand statements. Internal are things like mission, vision, values, super important, but they don't sell. That's not sales language. And then brand language that sells are things like your tagline, value proposition statement, differentiator. So I just want to think about that. There's really a couple big buckets of work. So let's go back to the first that you asked about, Erika, which is around your brand's tone of voice and why does that impact content marketing in general? Okay. I love to take a very simple approach to helping an organization or an individual really understand and get their arms around what is our brand's tone of voice or personality. And the question that I love to ask is a fun one. It's my favorite question of all, which is to say, if your brand were a person, who would it be?
I
And
start with that a lot too, because it's,
yes,
it can seem so cerebral otherwise, but that makes it so concrete. I love that.
yes. And you know what I love to do too is I love to push it further, not just talking about the personality traits, but I want them to name a public figure or celebrity. And I want them to think about how that person sounds. So, for example, I've written Oprah brands, Matthew McConaughey brands, Donald Trump brands, believe it or not. I've written Anderson Cooper, Brene Brown, Simon Sinek, Ryan Reynolds. All of these individuals have a particular way of speaking and sounding and showing up in the room. And when it comes to a brand's tone of voice, what we're actually trying to get our arms around is not just personality, like, oh, they're cool or they're nice, but what's the rhythm? If you were to close your eyes and listen and just listen, could you know what brand is talking to you? That's really powerful. So if the language actually sounds and seems like you when you write your content.
And I just think it's so important to actually document that versus what's happened, in the past, where frequently you'll get hired as a writer and somebody will say, "Oh, go read these things," and then you'll be able to get the voice. It's like, no, no, you won't. That's how you know
No.
there's going to be several rounds of revision in your future.
Well, it's funny. So let's say I'm writing a value proposition statement and a tagline with a client, right? So here's the tendency when people write. You ever tried to write an email before and you write the email and then you look back at what you wrote and you're like, well, that was a pile of gobbledygook, or it sounds so corporate-y and mumbo jumbo and this run-on paragraphs. You're like, ugh. Okay, so as humans, when we write any type of content, usually 9.9 out of 10 times, right, anybody will write the concept down and then go back and revise and tighten. You have to remember that. Really trained writers can just write top down. But most of us, unless we've built that muscle, what we're doing is we get the concept down. So then I ask you, as you're writing to go, okay, well, that's great, but how would Matthew McConaughey say it? And my clients will go, well, he wouldn't say any of that. He'd just say that. I'm like, aha. So then why are we saying anything else?
I love that. Well, and when you're going to create that kind of really, character-driven brand voice, you really need to understand your audience. And it does seem that frequently a lot of the audience understanding is anecdotes that are passed on from sales, et cetera. Or you'll be given a persona that somebody's really excited about, and it's a bunch of demographic information that has nothing to do with your job. Like it'll be a B2B persona talking about how, your target audience, that they're moms with kids. And you're like, that is not relevant to this technology product that I'm selling.
No.
Actually, that's not appropriate to be the way that we're going to market. Why is this here in this persona?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that a lot of us, even as seasoned marketers, right? We think of buyer personas or target audiences often just from a demographic standpoint. But what I like to do is challenge myself and challenge my clients to actually create a list of what I call buyer criteria, usually 20 or more, that include psychographics. And we're listing things like decision-making style. Let's say you sell software to B2B. Okay, who cuts the check? What's the biggest pains they're dealing with? What's the level of bureaucracy? Are the teams aligned or not aligned? How do they communicate? Are they autonomous and collaborative and coachable? What do you actually want to see in your ideal client? Because here's the thing. At the end of the day, with target audiences, we have to remember there's enough people out there that could potentially buy from us. And so we need to understand who our great buyers are, who's really the ones we want to speak with. But in order to even spot a ready and great buyer, we have to first understand what ideal looks like. We have to understand what utopia looks like. And so that means painting a picture in our minds of, if I could wave my magic wand and have the perfect buyer, who would that individual be? If we can get that down, the person behind the sector you're going after, or the demographics, all of a sudden you begin to recognize that your brand voice is speaking to another human who also has a voice. And that's where the magic happens.
Instead of speaking to the title in the org chart, which frankly, for a long period of time, a lot of B2B marketing has felt that way, where it's talking to an imaginary every person who has a specific function in a company, which then of course means that it engages and excites zero people.
That's right. Well, and the other biggest misconception too that I hear about, how do you speak to target audiences and who do you speak to is, it's interesting. And this ties into tone of voice, by the way, is someone asked me, well, am I supposed to brand myself for who I want to be or who I think I should go after? And the answer is actually no. So brand is not aspirational. You don't build a brand for who you think you should be or who you hope to be, or because your competitors are going through for group A, B, and C, and you want to take that market share, so you think you need to be like them and show up that way. Listen, if your competitors are doing a great job being blue and green, let them go be blue and green. There are enough buyers in the world that are really craving hot pink or orange and need you to be hot pink and orange. The principle is that once you know who you are and how you show up in the world, there are going to be people that are going to authentically resonate with your tone of voice and personality. And so that's why you don't want to deviate. You cannot be a chameleon with your brand and your content.
Well, and then that brings us to storytelling, because when done well, storytelling has the ability to be a really great way to connect with your community. But we've also seen some brands lean so heavily into storytelling that was not what their what their ideal buyer was interested in from them, that it has been, the kind of expense that gets somebody fired. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, how storytelling can either hinder or really enhance building those community relationships.
Oh my gosh, I love this topic. Okay, so my book is called Muting the Megaphone, Stop Telling Stories and Start Having Brand Conversations That Convert. Now you might go, what? You're a marketer. How do you not like storytelling, Kate? Okay, so let me back up for a second. I think that this concept, by the way, of Donald Miller, when he came out with the book Story Brand, and he brought storytelling to the modern marketer, fantastic concept. We really began to understand that we had to speak in such a way where we made the customer the hero of the journey. And I love that. The problem is nobody told us how to write that story, let alone write it in such a way where it wasn't a bunch of just droning on and on. Here's my struggle with storytelling. When we lead with storytelling, we often inundate people, because at its core, storytelling is one person talking and one person listening. My whole thesis is that your brand can create a conversation where at each sentence that they read, from your tagline down to your value proposition statement, down to your differentiators, into the next layers of your content, it's about creating a provocative, aka emotional response where somebody's going, interesting, what do they mean by that? Hang on, tell me more about this. Wait, what's in it for me? The idea is to move away from paragraph content at the front end of the conversation and instead lead with shorter but more impactful messaging that is authentic to your brand's tone of voice and opens the floodgates for someone to really engage at every single sentence and phrase. That to me is what is missing and what is needed. Now, the final thing that I'll tell you, Erika, though, on the storytelling piece too, is I do think story is important. I do think that we need story, but this is about order of operations and placement of content. And buyer psychology shows that when people first interact with a brand, they don't want to hear a story. They want to quickly understand, tell me what you do, tell me how you solve my problem, tell me how you're different. And it's only once the brand addresses those three things through what I call the brand trifecta, which is tagline, value proposition statement, differentiators, only then are buyers opting in to go, okay, that's interesting. Now tell me more. Now tell me how it works. Now tell me about the founders. Now give me white papers and case studies and all the other rich, often story-based content that we can and should create.
You know, you used one of my favorite turns of phrase, and that's the old "what's in it for me." And I know that there are people who've worked for me in the past when I worked in-house who probably still cannot hear that phrase without seeing my face in their nightmares, because I would write, especially on B2B social media content, I would circle it and I'd write "with them," underlined, exclamation point, because so often, so much of the brand content, especially on the B2B side, is so about the brand, and it's not about the person that the brand is helping. And we don't want to hear all about someone else. We want to hear about how, our lives are going to get better. We want to be engaged. And it's like, oh, it's like when you're cornered at some sort of an event by that person who just keeps talking about their, themselves and their kids and the this, that, and you're just like, oh, please, anybody I know, you're like looking over their shoulder, trying to scream help with your eyes. And that's, to me, that's also how we feel when brands are just coming at us, just broadcasting their story, because, we want to be we want to be the main character, not the brand, right? We, the consumer.
I completely agree. And, we've all been in those networking situations. And I always give this silly example, when you first meet somebody in a networking situation and they ask you, what do you do? Do you lead with a long story? Let me tell you about the time I was 5, Bob. And you can see their eyes glaze over. You're like, oh, I've lost them, right? We think we're supposed to do that. Or on the flip side, we go totally rogue and we go totally boring by saying something like, well, I do marketing. Well, wah. That's not compelling. Instead of talking about, well, I build brand messaging that drives revenue. What is it, the value that somebody could get their hands on that feels sticky, that they're like, well, that's really compelling. Okay, you've perked my interest. It's about finding the balance with brand messaging of saying, I can speak to what I do and the value I deliver, but do it in a way that they feel that they were a part of what I just said. That there is a glimmer of, you get me. There's creating the, oh my gosh, you get me moment with brand. That is really important.
So the question is, how do you figure out what it is that the people want from you and how it combines with that sweet spot of what you offer in your ideal customer, and also understand what your competition is doing, so that way you can differentiate from them and not just be another voice that sounds about the same in the marketplace. Do you have any tips around what kinds of competitive research or customer research that people should be doing for their brand strategy?
Yeah, so this is hitting on what we call differentiation points, right? So I think at the end of the day, by the way, let's talk about that in a message, in a brand message. I find that your three most important lines of defense, what I call the 1, 2, 3 punch, is really a tagline that states what you do, in B2B especially, a value proposition statement that's only a couple of sentences that says, here's the reality of what you're facing. Now, here's how you can solve that. AKA, like, yes, that's exactly what I'm dealing with. And then differentiator statements. Here's how we're different and better than the rest. And those are, some people call them the 3 uniques, but it's really like that 3 to 5 bullet points, Erika, that signify how are we apples to apples different and better than the competition. So one of the things to remember is you can never solve all of your differentiation points in only 1 or 2 sentences. This is why having a set of differentiation points is really important. Now, how you get there, kind of as you're speaking, are a few ways. How do you really state how you're different and not sound like everybody else? I think the first one is, yes, understanding your competitive landscape and certainly doing a bit of research on what they're doing. But the second thing is to do customer feedback loops. If you're not asking your customers and surveying your customers, why did you choose us? Why did you choose us over the competition? By the way, who else were you talking to? I ask my customers all the time. And it's fascinating. You're going to see an immediate pattern of 3 to 5 things that they're going to say that made you different and better.
And you got to be, and it's going to change over time. And every salesperson is going to have different answers to that. And you've got to make sure that the marketing folks, the people driving the brand and creating the content, hear it. Because I've also been in organizations where that didn't happen, where the marketing folks were the last to ever hear anything that customers said, which is such a shame.
It's so true. There's got to be alignment between sales and marketing. And, I think brand is your intersection moment, where I always say it's the glue that ties sales and marketing together. Because at the end of the day, if we're running off of the same pitch playbook of saying this is what we offer to the world and why you should buy from us, well, then all of a sudden something magical happens. Marketing gets to get you better leads, sales, and sales can come back and say, hey, here's what's working, here's what's not. And you begin to collaborate and improve that message over time and be able to surgically implement messages and content into the world that are going to get your ideal buyers to the table faster and more assuredly. The other thing I want to talk about for differentiation points too, though, is, one of the biggest things that drives me nuts on differentiators is Erika. Everybody says, well, it's our people. Our people are what make us different. And I'm like, that's awesome. But everybody's got good people. And I just want to
What is it about your good people? How are your good people different than everyone else's? And you so rarely actually get that.
However, this is so interesting. I did have a client that, and there's ways to turn our people into actual differentiators. Let me explain. One of the easiest ways to do that is to describe your proprietary approach. Maybe what you're actually getting at is the fact that your people follow a very systematic process, and they're process driven and process focused, and that's why they're great at their job. Ooh, well, so that's interesting. That's a little different to speak to that. We don't just, talk strategy. We follow a very systematic way of bringing you through the process. So yes, it's about your people, but there's something stickier there. The second thing is if your people can be back it up to say, like, we really are better than the rest. Now, I had an IT services company that I branded years ago. Turns out that their team had more Microsoft certifications than like any other organization out there. And these guys were so senior that they taught for Microsoft and other groups. Okay, now that we can back up because there was pure hard data that made sense. But here's the caveat too. In IT services, when they're selling to IT leaders who want them to come in and deploy and train teams on A, B, and C, let's say Microsoft servers, that matters to their ideal buyer. We don't talk about how great our people are, or we don't talk about a differentiator unless it actually matters to our buyers. What we think is cool and great and different about us may not even be something that our buyers care about. We have to always remember that.
And depending upon who you're talking to on the buying committee, because you're not just selling to that one person who cuts the check, you're signing to the decision, you're having to persuade the decision maker, you're having to persuade the person who's going to be using your product or service every day. Like, there are multiple people that you're talking to, and what the CFO cares about is going to be different than what the CMO cares about or an individual contributor cares about. It's not going to be the same. And I think that also is something that folks don't always take into account.
Well, that's right. And I think this is where we kind of, let's dovetail into that for a second, because this gets into this concept of having a layered brand architecture, more complex messaging structure and architecture in an organization, right? So even if you're a baby SaaS startup, right? I've done this before. Often they're having to get buy-in from the CEO, the head of sales and marketing, and the CFO for that purchase. So to your point, Erika, how do you do that beyond just having one simple set of differentiators? Well, what I do is, remember, I teach this brand trifecta method, which is, I always say, it's like the tip top of the content hierarchy. It's your tagline, value prop, differentiators. It's the stuff that leads into the rest of your content. It doesn't replace it. It just leads people in that optimum moment where they want to go deeper into the rest of your content. Okay, so keep that in mind. But what we often do is we'll have a top level tagline, value prop, and set of differentiators that I call like homepage language. It can speak to everybody, but it provokes them to want to go deeper. But then we do get audience specific. I'll build that same set of brand trifecta messaging per audience. So we will have differentiators that speak to the CFO. We will have differentiators that speak to the CMO, because what they deeply care about is different. And we've got to, again, speak to what's in it for them.
That's just so critical. So I'm so glad that you shared that. But then, of course, that leads me to ask, but how do you do all of these things? How do you manage them? Like, do you have specific tools or frameworks that you like to use? Because so often creating this kind of differentiated messaging ends up being a monster Microsoft document put in a table that somebody messes up and that everyone is terrified of using. So there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way than the 50 megabyte file of doom.
Yes, the 50 megabyte file of doom. Yeah, the intranet no man's land, as many organizations have, right? The Dropbox of dismay. Yes, and so I think that, it's whenever I get sent a Dropbox link and I don't even know what's in it for my client, I'm like, let's talk about organizing this. But here's the thing is, first and foremost, I think the number one thing that we should be thinking about is, where within your CRM or system are you deploying content outside of your website? First of all, your first line of defense is always going to be what? Website. Predominantly it's website. We know this. But if you think about that as like the hub, what else is coming off of that, right? So this is where, if you can find a single system like a HubSpot, actual HubSpot system, or Salesforce, or something that there are access points where sales and marketing access the same materials, that is extremely helpful. At its simplest thing, it's really saying, listen, we're going to have it in a single point of entry in the database, and then that messaging is then deployed across email, all of our sales assets and tools, etc. You do need a system. I recommend, even for small teams, believe it or not, Zoho is a great system that's integrated. If you're not needing everything in HubSpot, get started with Zoho. Maybe then you mature into something like a HubSpot or, Salesforce in its suite of tools. Outside of that, I personally think that having something as simple as Monday.com is a great way. If you don't have a project management tool, get one.
So I've been seeing, though, a lot of vendors promoting things like having a brand site or a brand book in order to do some of this. And I think that's really kind of speaking to the fact that there's always this struggle around how do we enable everybody and get everyone on the same page. Is that usually something that's necessary, or is investing in that kind of a tool really more of something that you're going to do if you're working with a number of external resources, a number of content creators? Because I can't imagine that your typical small organization that anybody would even go and look at it. I
No.
feel like that must be more of an up enterprise kind of
It is going to
offering.
be a larger mid-sized enterprise. Absolutely. If you have multiple agencies accessing your information that need to use the same set of messaging to deploy, let's say you've got one group running ads for you, one doing SC, fine. I understand having a central repository is great. But again, I would ask a different question, which is, do you need it in a book format, or what's the format that is easily copy and pastable, that's easily accessible, that's the central point location where all messaging lives? I think that, again, if everybody knows that they go to one spot, but that spot is in the same system where things are being deployed, it's a lot easier. If I have to log into a separate system to access that, it will never happen.
It's so true.
Right?
It's
Think
so
about
true.
it that way. You're like, it's never going to happen. So I just like to keep it very, very simple and go with a single point of reference is the way to do it, in my opinion.
Love that. So that's the good news, because I think, again, people start to feel like they have to get all the things in order to have a consistent brand. But really, it's just about making the decisions and gaining the understanding and documenting it with whatever tools you're already using. So I think that's, what people need to hear.
Well, yeah, and let's be real about this for a second. To have written down on a single sheet of paper, here's our brand's tone of voice, here's our tagline, our value prop, our differentiators, and core features and benefits. I'm sorry, is that supposed to take up more than one, maybe 2 pages maximum? What else are we even writing down? Then you're getting into deployment content. Then you're getting into tactical content. We did this social post that hits on this differentiator. We did this over here. So I think it's about just having the core pieces visible to everybody in the organization. That in and of itself is the reference point that most of us are going to want to create with sales and other stakeholders, that we all feel like we're looking at the same core language in the promise.
I love that. So that leads us to our natural kind of conclusion, which is, in all of your years of doing this, what do you think are the biggest mistakes that you see brands make when it comes to, trying to actually activate their brand in the content that they're creating?
The number one mistake that I see is that they do not have sales in the conversation in creating their brand, and sales continually in the conversation and the deployment of said brand. You cannot build brand in a box. It is not just for marketing. Your brand needs to be created with C-suite leadership. It needs to have sales in the room to create that, because there's going to be buy-in and collaboration. That's the number one thing. And it's actually why in my work in 10 years of doing this, I've really stuck to my guns and not taking a project unless I can get the founder or CEO in the room.
It's so important, because otherwise you're going to not see anything be approved, because their vision, people may think that they understand someone else's vision, but when you get down to the branding elements and that differentiated voice and the what kind of content are we going to create and all of that, you have to have that involvement. I'm with you on that. Otherwise, you're just creating something that is just going to be a waste of time.
You know what? And it's funny because I spoke at a conference the other week and I said, how many of you, it was to senior level marketers and mid-level marketers. And I said, how many of you would love to have higher budgets? Everybody raised their hand. I said, how many of you would love to have buy-in from leadership and from sales? Everybody raised their hands. How many of you would actually like to not have your work be just seen as a bunch of overhead or creative mumbo jumbo, but that the content you're building and deploying is meaningful and value adding and connecting with your audiences and creating pipeline for the organization? All hands went up. And I said, well, then the number one thing that you have to remember is that you have influence. And so for us as marketers and as content marketers, we have to remember that we have influence in bringing key stakeholders to the table as we create and shape our content so that they have buy-in, and more importantly, that they're going to back that. It makes sense to them. They're like, that makes sense of how we're going to attract our ideal buyers. I think it requires us as a modern marketer and content creator to no longer just sit behind our keyboards and write and create, but to have a seat at the table and to talk about why content is creating actual customers. And if we can have that conversation and tie the two pieces together between content and revenue, ears will perk up, we will get buy-in, we will see budget shift, and we will begin to notice that the nature of our work shifts in a very positive way.
I mean, and to me, the best part is it gives you the ability to prioritize and say no, because when you actually have a strong brand and you have this understanding of what will help drive people to make that purchase, then you're able to say, why no, I don't think we should chase after this, new channel. And no, why on earth would we spend all of that money at this event when it doesn't attract any of the people that we would want to actually sell to? Just because our competitor is there is not a good enough reason for us to blow this amount of our budget. Like, it just, to me, it finds you that money that we'd all like to have a little bit more of in our budget. It finds it by being able to roll things out.
You hit the nail on the head, honestly.
I think we're all looking for that. So, any parting words you have for folks who are really kind of struggling with having this kind of brand that really is able to be out there in front of their content? Like, they're still just thinking to themselves, our content just feels samey. It feels the same as everyone else's. Do you have any kind of words of encouragement?
Yeah. I think the first thing is, you know what? Think about that question of if our brand were a person, who would it be? And nail down your tone of voice. Just do that fun exercise. And then go ask, other people on your team and the organization. And you'll begin to notice, oh my gosh, this is who we really authentically are. That's the first tip to get out of sameness, right? And then I think the second thing is to just remember that at the end of the day, the purpose of your brand and the content you're creating is to really create a conversation with your customers. And so that impacts how you write sentences and not just inundate with paragraphs of content, but shorter phrases. Ask a question, drop an exclamation in there, use an em dash, create content that allows for a flow that feels conversational. And I think in doing that, you're going to find that your content doesn't sound like everybody else's. It feels way more like you, and it's going to attract the right buyers.
I love that. That's such great advice. Kate, thank you so much for being our guest today. And if folks want more from you, where can they find you online? Where are you speaking next? And also pitch your book.
Well, you can find tons of information about me and my book at my website, which is www.katedileo.com. And by the way, if you're on LinkedIn and you're checking this out, by all means, go ahead and not only follow me, but add me and send me a message. I, of course, am happy to respond to any questions you've got as it relates to branding.
Thank you so much. And we hope that we will see you back here in the Content Chat hot seat again soon.
Thanks so much, Erika.
Thanks. Bye-bye.